economic modeling based on a chapter from Philip Pilkington's upcoming book for the YSI Philosophy and Economics Working Group. Is that sufficient?
I would say so.
Sure.
We conduct regular webinars on different subjects in the philosophy of economics, and this is, I think, the 4th session so far we've done.
Yeah, I believe so.
So, yeah, and Amuk gave his introduction before we started the recording. We're very happy to have him here today as a speaker. As he said, he's presenting work done by Phil Pilkington coming out of an upcoming book. So thanks very much, Amuk, for doing this.
Sure. So should I start, or? Okay, I'll go ahead anyways. Or you haven't recorded yet, have you? Okay. Right. So the best introduction to Phil's topic is from the blog post that's put up on the group, but it's an interesting introduction from the world of artificial intelligence and computer science. So if you look at the world of 1960s computer science, there was a lot of optimism around among AI researchers. So people imagined that you would be able to take artificial intelligence to a point where you would be able to represent the entirety of cognitive function on a computer. Underlying this optimistic hope was an assumption that all the functions of the human mind could be mapped and could be codified in the computer scientific computer scientific framework. However, I mean, there is an objection to this that Phil documents in his blog post. It was by a philosopher computer scientist called Hubert Dreyfus, who in his book Alchemy in AI objected to this presupposition by saying that even though you'd be able to simplistically codify certain functions like rudimentary levels of conversation and things like this, you wouldn't actually be able to capture what he called know-how, right? So what you'd call common sense, because this knowledge is part of the sort of the holistic point of view which underlies the human brain. This actually comes out of phenomenology. So what we call the common sense context isn't actually reducible because it requires, quote, expressing all the interests and motivations and bodily capacities that go into making a human being within a symbolic schema. So this wasn't actually possible. And the way you can, and why is this important for economics? The entire neoclassical modeling and econometric enterprise depends on the idea that you can codify the various reasoning processes of economic agents when they're in the market, right? So you're thinking about representative agents. They're meant to model what people actually do, what people actually do when they're buying and selling stuff. Even though this presupposition exists within neoclassical economics, it isn't actually made clear in the classroom. So if you're in practice, I mean, in theory, you have various people who defend the neoclassical modeling enterprise. You have people like Samuelson and Friedman in various texts in the 1960s who defend the neoclassical modeling enterprise by coming up with all sorts of justifications. But in practice, in the classroom, it isn't actually gone into. Some people claim that their models are a literal representation of reality. Even though people aren't completely rational, they generally behave like this, quote, it's a good benchmark, whatever. Others will say that it's purely a theoretical construction. Still others, people even when they say it's a theoretical construction, they don't go on and suggest an alternative. They simply leave the students in question in a state of confusion. There's occasional, they come up with all sorts of justifications. I said it's just a benchmark. There's all sorts of ad hoc stuff that neoclassical economists say. And it's not just in the neoclassical tradition. There's some people in behavioral economics when you're trying to, to some extent, obviously behavioral economics takes into account empirical data, but when, generally speaking, methodology is considered waffle. It's something we don't discuss unless you're in a philosophy of the social sciences type context, which as we know isn't representative of the majority of academic economics. So methodology isn't worth investigating, at least according to neoclassical economists. But we know, or at least we think, that neoclassical models and models in academic economics should be open to question. So how do we distinguish between good and bad models? So here Phil goes back to Immanuel Kant, who sets up a criteria for good and bad abstractions. So we're going to get to models later, but we start with abstractions. According to Kant, we use empirical intuitions to move from the concept, which is an idea, to an object, which is a real thing. Good concepts allow you to move from a concept, such as a circle, to an object, such as a plate, which has this quality of being a circle. Now, you aren't actually going to experience the idea. You aren't actually going to meet the perfect circle in the street. It's a concept which means meant to map on to the world in some way. And there are certain correspondences, which I just called empirical intuitions, between the concept and the object. And what George Berkeley adds on to this is saying that you need language to convey these abstractions. So the better you understand these languages, or you can call them signifiers, signifiers is used as well, the better you understand the abstractions. So language and notation exist to simplify abstractions, right? So, for example, in economics, you have the national accounting identity. So output equals consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. The abstraction taking place here is to represent income flows in certain categories, right? So you're saying government purchases of goods and services are this thing G. So we know that in the economy, the government undertakes certain purchases of goods and services. So we represent that as G within and that's the concept, while the object is the actual government spending. However, even in this comparatively low-level abstraction, things are blurry. So, for example, Phil gives the example of Medicare payments. These are counted as consumption, but they don't actually go to the. They don't actually always go. They don't actually go to the consumer. They go to the insurance company, which is not necessarily what we mean by consumption. So, I mean, even at this low level, you have the mapping isn't exact. So, if you look at a slight development on from the national accounting identity, when you equate, you have, let's say for example, you have expenditure flows, so consumption, investment, government spending. You can then have income flows. You can, if like say leakages, what do you call leakages? So for consumption you have saving, for government expenditure you have taxation, and for exports you have imports. So you can have the balances approach where you equate investment, government, and investment spending, government spending, and exports to savings, taxation, and imports. Right, and this actually tells you. I mean, you can algebraically work around it to derive what private sector saving is. So, for example, private sector saving equals investment plus government spending. The net government deficit and the current account deficit, and that equals saving. And if you think about it a bit, it becomes intuitively obvious that you account for all private sector saving. Now, these abstract concepts, they satisfy the Kantian criteria because every single one of these abstract concepts, they correspond to real empirical things, real empirical observations that we can make. So, for example, saving, you think of someone depositing money in a bank, and there's a connection made between saving that actually happens in the world to saving that happens to the saving you think about in your head. Same thing with exports and imports. You can conceive of buying goods abroad. Similarly, imports are just the other side of exports if you think from the perspective of the other country. Government spending and taxation are obviously intuitively obvious because, I mean, you think it's not a metaphysical construction. These things actually exist in the world, or at least they correspond to things which exist in the world. So in that sense, they fulfill the Kantian criteria. But what if you don't make the Kantian leap? What if you have concepts which don't correspond to things in the world out there? According to Berkeley, this is when you forsake particular views of knowledge for barren speculation, embarrassing yourself with difficulties and disputes. So you're actually getting yourself caught in abstract concepts and not thinking about why you use concepts. You're conceptualizing for concept's sake. So these would be things, if you look at modern microeconomics, things like the representative agent. So here you have, the representative agent doesn't necessarily correspond to something out there in the world. I mean, you can't actually think of the one near someone who's actually a representative agent. And then the way neoclassical economists defend this is that representative agents are a benchmark, which are a good modeling construction. But this doesn't actually this doesn't actually suit the test that we made up right there. There are no empirical intuitions which connect the representative agent to the real world. So according to the Kantian criteria, this is a bad concept. Similarly, things like the natural rate of interest, or the NIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, would fall under the same category. Abstractions, although we need abstractions which don't correspond in any way to the real world. I mean, you can think about saving flows and investment flows which somehow come together, but you still have to jump through several hoops, and you can only justify it with reference to another model. There is no objective loanable funds market which is brought into equilibrium. So immediately this fails. Things like this fail the Kantian test, as so much of modern microeconomics does. So microeconomists and quite a lot of modern macroeconomists are often confused between object and concept in the Kantian framework due to the nature of their models. This makes their models useless, as they fail to make the Kantian leap between the idea and the idea or concept and the object in the real world which it is meant to correspond to. So another trap which you can get caught in, and which economists do get caught in, is that of determinism. So this is, Phil talks about Tony Lawson's work. So mathematical modeling, there's a tendency in mathematical modeling, when you build up large mathematical models, is that you tend to close your model, and closing the model means it becomes deterministic. So within a modeling construction, so a modeling construction is by nature imperfect because it's a representation of reality, and there's a difference between what you're doing in the model and what's happening in reality. There is a temptation, if the modeling construction reaches to a certain level of complexity, to close it up, to ensure that the systems of equations or whatever are, I wouldn't say not so much internally consistent, but closed. All the variables are defined, and this leads to modeling determinism. So determinism doesn't work in the same way as microeconomics, according to Lawson, like it does in physics, because of free will. Once your modeling system or your model is closed up, it allows no space for free will by definition because it's deterministic. Now, I mean, I won't get into the obvious, from a philosophical point of view, the obvious thing would be to imply some kind of compatibilism, but it doesn't. I mean, the determinism of mathematical systems are not the same things as the various determinisms that occur in philosophy. So that's another discussion. So, for example, a DSG model is a closed system. So, because all the variables are defined, there is no room for saying, okay, I'm not going to have fixed preferences now, unless obviously you change the model. There's no room for saying, okay, I'm going to commit suicide, even though that actually happens in the world. I mean, there's no way you can get from a DSG in a basic normal DSG model to erratic behavior, such as suicide and so on and so forth. I mean, not to suicide, any kind of erratic behavior which would be non-deterministic. This is an issue with a deterministic model. So even in a basic Keynesian abstraction, to contrast with deterministic models, like animal spirits, there's indeterminacy because all the variables haven't been defined. It allows you to make the Kantian leap between the signifier, animal spirits, and the actual object, people panicking in the stock market. So if you think about animal spirits, you think about speculation, boom and bust, the stock exchange, and things like that. And it's useful because you go directly from the concept to the real world. The whole Kantian test of empirical intuitions is fulfilled. This is not true of all the other concepts that I named before. This tendency to get lost in your own signifiers is typified by the very idea of micro-founded macro, so the micro-foundations debate. So here I'm going to quote Phil. He describes the debate pretty well. Basically, the micro-foundations controversy arose when some economists, most notably Robert Lucas, lifted the repression that the likes of Samuelson had undertaken in the 1930s and 1940s. Lucas and others began to ask exactly how economists should reconcile the rational utility maximizing individual with the macroeconomic constructions of the Keynesian era, the new Keynesian era, neo-Keynesian era, whatever you like to call it. What they quickly found was none of the Keynesian, or rather pseudo-Keynesian, constructions worked once you threw the rational utility maximizing agent into the mix. If everyone was acting rationally, you would always have what economists call market clearing. Thus, labor markets, for example, would always clear, and thus there could be no unemployment. Similarly, talking about investment falling short of intended savings and financial markets in turmoil made little sense if you assumed that all the actors involved were the crystal ball wielding economic supermen that microeconomic theory must assume to function coherently. The micro-foundations proponents are thus engaged in a rather crude deconstruction of the reigning Keynesian models of the day, and in doing so, they had found a vacuum at the core. The mainstream did not know what to make of this. They had banished expectations and uncertainty all those years ago, and had embraced the ridiculous postulates of the old microeconomics, this would be Marshallian. So they found themselves trapped. They turned instead to work out silly logical reasons for why some people might not, in a given situation, act perfectly rationally. Nobel Prizes were handed out for coming up with ridiculously simple, common sense reasons why this might or might not occur. Some said the different economic agents had access to different types of information, and this could lead to problems. So Stiglitz, Akerlof, Lemons, and all that stuff. Others said that changing prices too quickly might be difficult for institutional reasons. Greg Mankiw in menu costs, although he hasn't won a Nobel Prize. This empty and vacuous nonsense, often dressed up in semi-difficult but ugly and unwieldy mathematics, became the basis of debates for decades. So, the micro-foundations are actually impossible. You can't actually look at the billions and billions of individuals in the economy and come up with micro-foundations for them, which, if you look at the very idea of micro-foundations, you would actually have to do to come up with micro-foundations in the true sense. This is neither possible nor desirable. Therefore, we need to use abstractions to group individuals into manageable piles, like social class. But you can't take these groups literally, because this would be to confuse concept with object, Kantian terminology. So here Phil gives the example of the groups that are used in the Kalekian group of post-Keynesian models, so workers and capitalists. So if the way you think about workers is the workers are the people who earn income from wages, and capitalists are those who earn income from profits. If you take this literally, you can find the Kalekian framework wanting, because Phil gives the example of, for example, dividend payments that people earn from insurance. This technically counts as profit, but is earned by people we call workers. Now, you might conclude from this that the category of workers and capitalists is useless, but you're simply working on a different level of abstraction than Kalecki was. You're looking at these abstract categories of workers and capitalists and saying these are real economic objects, but for Kalecki, this served a different purpose. These were concepts which didn't necessarily map onto the real world. You can still use them, but you can't expect to encounter them out there in the real world. I mean, they can still have some, the usefulness and representation are two different things. Right. So, at first glance, it might seem that you can't actually get to good reasoning because all the models seem to have some kind of gap. We went through the national accounting identities and the worker capitalist distinction. So how do we actually get good reasoning? So here Phil talks about schemas. So schemas, according to Kant, it's a rather dense passage, which Phil quotes. The schema is in itself always only a product of the imagination. But since the synthesis of the latter has at its aim no individual intuition, but rather only the unity in the determination of sensibility, the schema is to be distinguished from an image. Thus, if I place 5 points in a row, this is an image of the number 5. On the contrary, if I only think a number in general, which could be 5 or 100, this thinking is more the representation of a method for representing a multitude, for example 1,000, in accordance with a certain concept than the image itself, which in this case I could survey and compare with the concept only with difficulty. Now, this representation of a general procedure of the imagination for providing a concept with its image is what I call the schema for this concept. So Phil goes on to explain this in the next paragraph. The process of trying to describe the concept is what Kant calls the schema of the concept. Here we should note that the schema has no empirical existence. What we mean by that is that we shall never encounter the schema of the concept in our lived experience. So schemas are non-empirical entities that we use in thought, which help us to construct the world around us. We can't actually think about the world in itself. We have to use these schemas, these concepts, which have to order the world. So models, if you think about them in terms of schemas, are abstractions built upon abstractions. They're in a way schema squared. So if you think about, let's take something like the indifference curve, or a better example would be the idea of supply and demand equilibrium. If you look at the individual concepts which need to be presupposed to construct a supply and demand equilibrium, you can see that it is an abstraction built out of abstractions. This is why models are so susceptible to the two traps we named before, the determinism, which forces you to close it up, making it hermetic and self-referential and unreceptive to the real world, and bad schemas. So the foundations of the models themselves, because they haven't been questioned in the Kantian way that we question the other models, they won't actually represent the real world. Often, neoclassical economics is guilty of both problems, because you have bad schemas which don't refer to anything, in reality, and you have bad models which put the schema, which focus people on trying to use the real world to fit the model rather than questioning the foundations of the model itself. So this was asymmetric information. For example, asymmetric information only matters if you're thinking from the point of view of perfect information. So you think about perfect information, then you think about some deviation from that. Therefore, you have asymmetric information as a big, as a big reveal. But if you think about it from the perspective of, let's say, for example, another social science, the idea that people have different levels of information isn't really revolutionary. Or even you think about it from a commonsensical point of view. And it only makes sense once you assume perfect information. And what you're doing is you're actually trying to fit the real world, where perfect information is rarely true, to the model. So this is the problem of having abstractions upon abstractions. Once you accept the first level, you're trying to fit the real world into the second level. The answer is to not accept the first level, because it doesn't fit the Kantian text. So the two levels of abstractions, are in danger of getting caught within their own signifier. So this is Berkeley again. We need signifiers to understand concepts, but if we don't understand that the signifiers refer to things out there in the real world, we get caught within signifiers and we don't actually think about what they mean. So this is why economists in the business world find a lot of advanced technical macroeconomics unsuited to practical use. I mean, macro and micro, really. And Phil talks a lot about how business economists in the business world for practical use don't actually find quite a lot of what academic economists consider useful to be that applicable to what they do, and they rarely use rules of thumb. And I think personally that this accounts for quite a lot of progressive economic thinking from the business world. If you think about someone like Bill Janeway from coming out of the private sector, a lot of his, if you read Doing Capitalism in the Innovation Economy, which I do recommend, a lot of his practical insights actually eschew the neoclassical framework. And there's other people as well, called George Soros is actually a good example, because he sees that rational expectations of macroeconomics and the efficient market hypothesis don't actually work in a practical sense. Academic economists, by contrast, get caught in their own schemas, completely failing to make the leap between concept and object. So in doing economics, we should therefore keep schemas at arm's length, poking them out and philosophically deconstructing them. And what do you call it? Phil actually concludes quite well here. Economics, properly understood, is not the art of constructing models. Rather, it is the art of furnishing, elaborating, understanding, and integrating schemas into one's process of thought. Economics is not about building abstract castles in the sky, nor is it learned or perfected by engaging in such constructions. It is more like a language that is learned through thorough understanding and practice. You do not learn good sentence construction by studying linguistics. Rather, you learn it by becoming as acquainted as possible with language, with words and their multifarious meanings. The vast majority of the problems with economics today are associated with the fact that economists have tried to become masters of prose by consulting the technical manuals on linguistics. And these manuals have themselves been produced by men and women who can barely string a sentence together. Phil, anything to add?
Thanks for the presentation. Yeah, very good, pretty comprehensive. I took some notes on what you said. I could run through them if you'd like.
Sure.
Okay. What do I have? 10 minutes, maybe.
Sure. Is
Okay.
that okay, Jay?
Is that okay? I'm assuming. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think that's okay. Okay. So. Okay. The start, you were saying. You raised a question, which I think it's just worth, like, people who engage in economic reasoning and especially model building. I'd say especially model building. Ask over and over again to themselves. I think that you get a different response on this question, not only from who you ask, but when you ask them, and that's a very, very problematic thing. The question is the model a mirror, or is it a thought experiment? I mean, obviously, there's a huge difference between the two things. What I mean by a mirror is, is it supposed to reflect the real world immediately? And I don't mean that like, Joan Robinson's famous phrase, a map on the scale of 1 to 1 is no good. But, if we have a map on a more realistic scale, we're still talking about a sort of a mirror of the world. A map that's supposed to be a mirror, a map of, say, Dublin is supposed to be somewhat of a mirror of say, Dublin. So if we're dealing with a mirror, then, or a map, or whatever metaphor you want to use, you're dealing with something that immediately represents reality. Whereas if you're dealing with a thought experiment that you undertake in order to try and figure out reality in a sort of analogical way, you're dealing with something completely different. For example, if you're applying a model, or even what we might call a schema, very a simple identity or something, if we're applying that using econometrics to the data, we have to be assuming it's either a mirror or a map. We cannot be assuming it's a thought experiment. I mean, this.
Right.
I'm very surprised that people don't talk about this more, because it seems so intuitively obvious. I mean, if you get the real world data and you plug it into an econometric program and you estimate the result in accordance with your model or with your stripped down assumptions or whatever you want to use, you must be assuming that your model or your assumptions mirror the real world to some extent. I mean, maybe it's not perfectly, but you have to be assuming it to some extent. Now, I'm not really saying which we should be doing. Personally, I think that models should probably be thought experiments, but I think I'd even be happy if people were just able to answer that question coherently. Because as I said, I don't think it's just that different economists will answer that differently. But I think that if you ask the same economist on a given day, they might answer it differently. And that seems opportunistic to me. I think it should be...
So you're distinguishing between, let's say, someone like econometricians and macroeconomists?
Yeah, I think macroeconomists will be more inclined to say this is a thought experiment. I mean, I'll give you one macroeconomist who I'm obviously not a huge fan of, but who I think does actually insist on the thought experiment angle, is Paul Krugman. He's very much so. He's very much so in the thought experiment camp. He'll always say that, you know, ISLM is sort of a good thought experiment to view the world, and you can find statements of him in exchange with James Galbraith in the 90s saying, oh yes, these are thought experiments, these are analogies to allow us to work through things. But then at the same time, you know, Paul Krugman's done a lot of econometric work, estimating unemployment rates in the EU. And, you know, you have to be consistent about this. If you're estimating a model on unemployment, you're not assuming a thought experiment. So that's what I mean by people will change their minds depending on what they're doing. I think the discipline would do very well fully determining what they're saying. I'm not even as concerned to dictate which they should go with, mirrors or thought experiments, but just to be clear on it. I mean, to my mind, I'm quite clear on that in my own mind. So I just see a bit of skirting around the bushes on that.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask.
Yes, sorry.
Is there your distinction? You were talking about just from my presentation, the map and the mirror.
Sorry, I've probably been confusing there. When I say map and mirror, I mean the same thing. The alternative will be a thought experiment, like something, you know, a thought experiment in your own head to kind of sort out what you think.
Representation versus concept.
Yeah, pretty much, or a pure concept. You wouldn't. I mean, if you run through a DSG model, I mean, I'd assume that you're just making a sort of metaphor about the world, and you don't actually expect the DSG model to be a mirror of the world or a map of the world. But it's unclear to me what economists think in this regard. They seem opportunistic in what they think, to be frank.
Right.
The other thing, I just thought it was worth highlighting that economics, when it was emerging in the at the turn of the modern economics, I suppose you'd say, at the turn of the 20th century and for the first half of the 20th century, economists, especially Keynesian economists, didn't actually spend a lot of time building models. I mean, some of them did. People like John Hicks certainly built models. Paul Samuelson did. The neo-Keynesians had a tendency to go in the modeling direction. I don't think you can find any models in Keynes. I think it's all what we might call schemas. I think that was his approach. But I think there is, he has something like the ZD diagram in the general theory, but he's very dismissive of it. He says, oh, this is just a little silly thought experiment. Whatever, you really want to just grasp the concepts in my book.
It's very interesting you say that, actually, because I was listening to Krugman giving a talk on Keynes, and he distinguishes between people who follow Chapter 12, the thing about the state of long-run expectations, and people who follow Part 1 of the general theory, essentially between what I would say post-Keynesians and neo-Keynesians. He said the Chapter 12ers were people who thought that the general theory had no mathematics. And then he brings up the page that you're talking about as an example of claiming Keynes as a neoclassical.
Well, I don't have the quote in front of me, but Keynes is very dismissive of that chapter. Yeah, I think, without getting into it too much, I think Roy Harrod convinced him to put it in as a sort of a diplomatic gesture. But I think definitely, if you read the rest of the general theory and you read the treatise on money, I don't think Keynes is modeling in the old school sense. I'd also say that people like Hayek aren't doing it. Oh, sorry, Jay. I need to mute my mic when Ami's talking.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay. I'll try and do that. what was I saying? I don't think people like Hayek were doing that either, or Wicksell, or any of these guys. I think they were more so trying to get schematics going, you know, get useful concepts. That kind of brings up what you were saying at the end, that working economists don't seem to use the modeling approach. They seem to use what I'm referring to as the schema approach. There's a quote at the end of the chapter there from an economist called W.R. Allen, who made this point in 1974, and I'll read it in the original because it's interesting. He said, the economic theory the government economists are using is the theory most of us learned as sophomores. They think the economist's framework is the right one to weigh the advantages and disadvantages as best they can see them. But when economists sit down and prepare models to try to trace out these consequences in any sophisticated fashion, they think it's about as apt to be misleading as it is helpful. And in my experience talking to working economists in both the government and in the financial sector, I get this enormous impression. And that sort of leads on to what you were saying, that some of this that the working economists can also often produce more interesting stuff. And you mentioned Bill Janeway and George Soros. I'd also mention, of course, Wayne Godley, because he was first and foremost a working economist. Keynes, I think, as well, was first and foremost a working economist. He worked
investor
at the government and so forth. I would also say, though, because of the nature of how people are being trained and so forth, this can also have very negative effects. For example, you find everywhere among working economists, I'm not saying every working economist believes in this, but the default position for a working economist, one of the things they often fall back on is, for example, something like the quantity theory of money, right? So that you increase money supply and inflation increases in lockstep. And, you know, without getting into the merits of that argument too much, I'm obviously not a big fan. It's obviously failed after the crisis. The QE programs have not had the result that somebody thinking in terms of the quantity theory of money would expect. And I think the problem there is because those people spend so long working through exercises that they end up explicitly saying they don't use, that they don't give enough time to thinking about more schematic issues, like, you know, does the quantity theory make sense? Is there an alternative theory? And so forth, you know, and I think the quantity theory and maybe alternative theories like endogenous money or whatever, these are schematic reasoning. They're not models as such.
Right.
We discuss them, we're not really discussing models.
Sure. I just think it's important to point the distinction out, because you had a feud with Matthias Griselli, also of INET before, and I think that originally, although before reading this chapter, I found myself on Matthias's side when he was claiming that to do economic reasoning, you always need some kind of model, and I was conceiving models as schemas, and the distinction between models and schemas is extremely important.
I think it's helpful. I mean, the reason I wrote the chapter was certainly in response to the discussion with Matthias, but also, I mean, so many people brought this up with me. Paul Krugman makes the points all the time that you need models. And in fact, one of the things that really struck me, I was thinking of including it in the chapter because the book hasn't gone off to publishers yet. But in the 90s, he gave an interesting defense of what he considered to be modeling. He mentioned that if a Russian criminal holds dollars in a safe, that's counted on the national accounts as a capital outflow, right? And he said that's a good justification for why we should think in terms of models. Well, if you make the distinction that I'm making, that's clearly not a model, that's a schema. Because I'm totally with Krugman there. We do need to think of that in terms of a capital outflow from the United States. And we have to take it into account on the balance of payments accounts and so forth if we want to make sense of that phenomenon as economists. But I'm not with him on saying that's a model, because I think to equate forming an abstraction about a criminal holding dollars in terms of the national account is a very different exercise to building a DSG model. And I think we're going to get ourselves very serious difficulty if we can't conceptually distinguish between building a very abstract ESG model and constructing national accounts.
One last point, sorry. One last point before we go into open discussion. Matthias calls the approach, for example, that you promote here, it's calls them a rule-based approach. So what, in the sense that you come up with statements which connect broad aggregates in terms of, let's say, if you increase government spending, GDP will increase, given so on and so forth, and you know, you have these kind of statements which are rules which apply to your economic philosophy. And also, while you answer that, it's a clarification that I want a kind of clarification that the Kantian criteria that I set up just there in the talk isn't actually the same as positivism. It's similar because you're looking at distinction between concepts and reality, but it's not really the same as the specific philosophy of positivism.
Will we move to open discussion, or I'm not sure?
No, just answer that.
Do you want me to answer that more comprehensively?
Yeah.
I think there's I think somebody else wants to say something about that. Doug.
Sure. Doug?
Okay, can you hear me yet? Can you hear me? Okay. Interesting discussion and hard to get my mind around it. We started with the issues of artificial intelligence and computerization and modeling, which has implications for being able to put into mathematical form the way we're thinking. By the time we get to schemas, it's a little bit more open to what real people do and language that might not be easy to model in a computer, which I think is a progress, period. What strikes me is that typical economic thinking is not good on the input side, that is what people really do, but it's also not very good on the output side, that is what people really do, like falling in love, having revolutions, the economy shifting political parties, and things like that. So economics tends to be in this middle world where the big things that people do are not included. Now, what really strikes me is the value of looking at the history of why this happened. That is, what are the forces that are going on? For example, obviously every economist has to have an approach to economics that lets them get a job. That puts pressures of kind of a Darwinian sort on the thinking. And formalistic stuff seems to lead to jobs and usefulness in the economy. More humane thinking tends to want to be stripped out. I would propose that the political forces in a society to limit economics to abstract thing that looks mechanical is motivated by a desire to leave out the real feelings of people such as disgust, despair, depression, things that would lead them to act against the economy in a certain way, like revolutions. So that what we want is an economics, as when I say what we want, what economics wants in its context is an economics which makes it very difficult to talk about poverty, the pain of unemployment, the stuff that people are actually concerned about in their lives. So we're left with an economics which makes mechanical connections between parts of the economy but does not make emotional ones where people's values really count. End of thought.
Phil, you want to take that?
Is this a discussion with you or me? I'm not sure.
Well, it's I think. Well, I mean, there's something I can say, and I certainly recommend if Doug hasn't already seen it, the film by Adam Curtis called The Trap, which actually deals with quite a lot of these themes, which I think Phil is familiar with. And I think there's something to this. Phil talks about political repression which forms Samuelsonian economics, and and there's certainly something in neoclassical economics, or neoclassical new consensus, new synthesis, whatever you want to call it, that seems to reflect outside political pressures and doesn't talk about quite a lot of things that are political. But my objection to that would be that, to some extent, if you want to talk about the emotional stuff, I mean, I suppose isn't that best done in another discipline like psychology and sociology? Obviously, there should be integrations, but economics, as I see it, is directly concerned with the allocation and distribution of scarce resources. And I mean, there might be a tangential relationship between the direct examination of emotions, such as what you recommend, but it certainly doesn't seem to me to be direct. Phil?
I suppose I'd just say quickly that I think the concern that Doug raises is a really large one, and not just in terms of emotions or political revolutions, but just how we integrate political decision making into how we understand the economy. I mean, if you want to, I mean, I write a fairly regular column on Al Jazeera on economics, and most of what I'm talking about is what's happening in the politics of the day. You know, what's happening in the Eurozone, what the tensions are between various countries. I mean, I try to add to that pure economic analysis, but you can't understand the economics in a vacuum. And my impression is the way economists are currently trained, it makes it very difficult for them to approach it in that way. And I've heard from very prominent people in central banks and finance that they have a huge problem hiring these economists because they have to retrain them to think in a different way. That's all I'd say about that.
Thomas?
So maybe I'll jump in here. Thomas and I have agreed that I would go sort of respond to this directly. This is Jay speaking.
Oh, sure.
So I hear what Doug was saying, and I would like to restate it in maybe a different way. And also, Amuk and Phil, your response does reflect this as well. But let me try to put it in the following terms. Doug says economics is stuck at a certain level in which it maybe responds to certain phenomena that it can model or that it can actually represent, but then it leaves out a whole range of other economically important phenomena that actually impact both input and output, as Doug mentioned it. Then Phil said that basically, yeah, we're not very good at integrating political or political economy analysis into our modeling frameworks. And so let me just make 2 points here. The first is that it seems that the neoclassical thought system tends to emphasize quantitative measures over qualitative measures. That means any sort of hierarchies between the quality of different phenomena are sort of broken down into one single quality that could be compared and just plugged into a model. That's sort of a general observation where there's rarely any discussion about the quality of an object, a commodity, or money. Rather, the question is about quantity, and therefore a lot of these questions about hierarchies, and this brings me to my next point, is lost. It struck me just now that when Doug was speaking that it seems sometimes economists can make somewhat reasonable conclusions with their models, but it's more or less lucky. They're lucky that they can do it. If it's not because they know exactly that this model fits that particular environment. And it seems like there's a hierarchy of frameworks here, a hierarchy of regimes, and the political regime might be a regime that's above the economic framework, in which the pure economic analysis comes into its own. Maybe the DSG model works if the political sphere is completely not relevant for that type of question or that time period. Then the DSG framework does make reasonable predictions, and that's just because economists got lucky and there's no dominating political event that dominates the political, the economic outcomes. And likewise, you can make a whole story of this because we don't understand, as economists, we're not trained, as Phil was saying, to appreciate when economic questions come into their own and can be analyzed with certain frameworks, neoclassical or otherwise. And therefore, you know, that's what the central bankers are saying. The economists don't even know the real world. They don't know what they're hammering against. They don't know what they're analyzing. They have no appreciation for the regime shifts in the actual economy they're trying to analyze. And therefore, when you're confronted with reality, they're at a loss. And the only reaction that an economist has is to press it into the existing framework that they've been trained with, because there is no other conceptual way for an economist to deal with this particular problem. But yeah, so I'll end my thought on this. Maybe others want to respond.
I completely agree, but I would like to preface my earlier response by saying that I'm not calling for economics to be apolitical, by no means. I'm just saying that there is an economic sphere, and things like the pain of unemployment are perhaps described better by other disciplines. That's all I was saying. I just think that although obviously there's a role for politics and economics and all this stuff, and neoclassical economics is apolitical and all that stuff that I agree with, and the regime shifts and all the stuff that Jay said I completely agree with, I'm just saying that quite a lot of the emotional stuff are perhaps better described and better dealt with other disciplines. Phil?
Yeah, I'd just say quickly in response to what Jay was saying, when you say that if there's no political events that that some models work well, you referred specifically to DSG. I assume what you mean is that there were no crises during the time when there was relative harmony. My concern with that is that what we're effectively, I think this goes back to Milton Friedman, but I won't get back into it too much. That the terms for saying that the model works or doesn't work become altogether very vague or not very clearly defined. So, for example, we say a DSG model works when there isn't a crisis, but that seems to me really unspecific. And I mean, it's like, if you know what I mean, like it's not. I mean, it's working in a sense, but at another sense, I'm not sure that it's making, predictions that you couldn't make without it. I just think that when it goes into that level of abstraction, it's not really clear what the criteria for testing the model are. I don't know if you were talking about something more specific, like maybe they were getting good GDP estimates or inventory accumulation. I'm not sure what you mean by it was making predictions without political. But if it is the case that we're just saying, well, there was relative tranquility for 20 years, and that's debatable in itself. I mean, I can count 5 major financial crises in the past 20 years. So we have to be clear about what the criteria is for testing and not testing that. I think that might go a little bit further from our discussion today, but I just think it's right.
It's just important to note.
I would like to
sorry, go ahead.
Put in here that when the DSG model is, quote, working, it can still be the reality that the rich are getting richer and unemployment is increasing. So the model makes predictions in a limited domain that's only of interest to some of the people in the economy, not to all the people.
It's just important to point out that quite a lot of the predictions that the DSG models made were in fact post hoc. So I mean, Phil talks about how someone could talk about, not Phil, it's someone else, Mark Blythe, I believe. He said that across the 20th century, mid-20th century, there are actually 5 theories of inflation. I counted 5. You could talk about central bank credibility. You could talk about the Nauru. You could talk about oil shocks, you could talk about bad unions, and I mean, obviously, I'm not saying all of these are wrong. I'm just saying the economics professions, the ability to switch between completely different reasons for reasons for what causes inflation suggests that quite a lot of the predictions were actually post hoc rationalizations.
I'll just say very quickly, yeah, I think there's a lot of that in economics that needs to.
Thomas?
And just to close the loop on this question, I agree with what Phil and Amuk you were saying just now. I was not advocating a case for these G models work well by any criterion, I think, but if you're believing in them, you can make a case in a certain time period that they work, and that's what economists sort of, when they do get lucky sometimes that these models tend to, do their job, quote unquote. But you're right, Phil. Another framework might have done exactly the same or better, or even using no model at all, you could have done similar predictions. But yeah, I didn't want to sort of make this a discussion about DSG at all. It was rather sort of economists get lucky when they're right, and not because they're pretty good at what they do. It's just because they're lucky. I think that's what they have the right framework, not because they chose the right framework, but because the framework came to them and they got lucky in that time. That was the point I was trying to make.
Fair enough.
So do you want to continue this discussion, because my question is going back to the original talk by Amuk.
That's fair, and yeah, go on.
Okay, so yeah, for sure, it was interesting, and thank you very much. I think you were really hard on the economists and their modeling practices, and I think that's probably deserved, and that critique deserved to be repeated, because it's this way of being caught in a world, you call it conceptions of conceptions, or abstractions of abstractions, that is like unrelated to anything, is of course not a very good scientific practice. I do, however, get a little bit confused when you try to relate this to some of the philosophical or epistemological discussions, and especially when you bring in Kant and Berkeley. I get a little bit like, because I get confused, because if I go back to my philosophy 101, Kant is a transcendental idealist, and Berkeley is almost like a vulgar idealist. So what they, as I understand, is epistemologically stressing is how human knowledge is in a active constructing relationship to the real world. To Berkeley, this is almost like there is no real world. There is only human perception. And to Kant, he's not like that. He says we can't know about the real world as it is, but we can know only about our own perception of the world, and this perception is actively shaping the world as it is to us. And I think that's not, when you were talking much more like you were saying that there is a Kantian leap or a Kantian criterion, and it's just that concepts should correspond to the real world, which seems weird given like Kant's fundamental epistemological position of this idealism. So
you're saying that concepts have to correspond. You're saying, sorry, just clarification. You're saying concepts can't be, the idea of good and bad concepts from a Kantian perspective doesn't make sense because they have to correspond to the real world.
I do think that it makes sense to be talking about good and bad concepts, but I'm confused. I don't know exactly where in his authorship that you're drawing and I didn't read everything of Kant. I just know like the basic epistemological, like if you read the Critique of Pure Reason or the Prolegomena, then you will. The groundworks, it's not called groundworks, the one that's called Prolegomena, it's like a small version of the Critique of Pure Reason, where he's talking about how concepts shape the world, and I'm just trying to figure out how this relates, because when you're talking about Kant now, I get this idea that you're much more like having a simple relationship between a concept and reality, where you can have a criterion saying, does a concept correspond to reality or not? And if that was the case, the problem would be simple, right? Because if there was just like, you could distinguish between like government spending refers to something in reality because there is a government that spends, and that's the real world, whereas Nairo is not passing the Kantian criterion because you can't go out and observe the Nairo, then the problem would be easy. And I think that it is necessary to criticize neoclassical economics for abstracting in a weird sense, but I don't think, trying to figure out what you're saying, that I don't get a good Kantian criterion for, like, because I don't think that there is that much of a difference between the government spending and the Nairo. Both things are kind of abstractions that we have constructed in order to make sense of a complex reality, and both things have an active role on how we perceive what the economy is. So I like the critique, but I'm getting extremely confused at what you present as the alternative.
I have, I suppose Phil. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. So this is something I think actually Amu left out of the talk, but which was in the chapter B. I absolutely agree with you that Kant's concepts are fully constructed, and the example I give in the chapter is numbers, that different numerical systems will produce different conceptual results. So, for example, the Roman numerical system didn't have a number for 0, and it led to great difficulties with calculation. And then when the number 0 was imported from India in, I think, the 13th century, it made calculation a lot easier and probably allowed for the development of differential calculus and so forth. These are not empirical relationships. These are fully things that we imagine. And I fully agree with you as well that the case of a government, when we conceive of government spending, a lot of this is pretty much construction. Now, I don't think it's all construction, though. I mean, there's an act where one person gives another person money. I mean, that's an empirical relationship, and without getting too much into it, Berkeley may be an idealist, but he's also a radical empiricist. So he believes in his perceptions, as it were. He doesn't think they're fully constructed. There's an element of religious stuff in there, but we need not get into it too much.
Well, the perceptions come from somewhere, but it could be, yeah.
Exactly, I mean, the perceptions come.
Yeah.
Sorry, and I think for Kant as well, there is a perceptual reality that they're not Humean skeptics, as it were. There is a perceptual reality. So I mean, if you want to take the example of government spending, I think it's a nice one, because if the government spends money, if it gives me a social welfare check, or if I'm a policeman, or it gives me a tax credit or anything like this, there is an empirical event there. There is something that I see before my eyes. My bank machine registers a larger deposit. I can take more money out of the machine and spend it. Now, when I conceptualize that as government spending, and especially when I write it into a GDP equation or anything like that, or a multiplier relation or anything, then I'm engaged in abstraction. But I think there is an empirical phenomenon underlying it. I think when you get really deep into Kantian epistemology, I agree, this becomes very difficult, and you have the problem of the noumena and the inability to access immediately and everything like that. But in that regard, I kind of prefer Berkeley's philosophy, that you basically do have a perceptual world. It does come from somewhere, and you really have to take that perceptual world as a given, and then be a little bit careful about the abstractions that you make. And I think that comes back to something like Nairo. Nairo does not have the same empirical underlying relationship as the government spending. As I said, the government spending, if it's spent into my bank account, I can go and look at the deposit, I can take it out, I can take the money, I can do what I want with the money. But in the case of the Nairo, I can't see that anywhere. It's way more abstract. I can't see a Nairo. I mean, we can try and observe it in the data. We can try and observe a turning point in the data where a certain amount of unemployment correlates with a certain amount of inflation. But even
But
there,
you're imposing it.
yeah, even there we don't immediately see it. That's not an immediate. We have to form a sort of a Humean causal relationship there in our mind. We have to make the hypothesis that when the unemployment goes down past a certain amount, that the inflation rises due to this abstraction we call naira. So I think there is a slight difference between something like government spending and naira. But I'll leave it there.
So I would like to make a comment here. In science, there are two problems. One is, do our concepts fit reality? But on the other side, does reality fit our concepts? That is, are we casting our net way too narrowly to deal with the phenomena that's interesting? For example, I don't think anybody in economics was good at predicting the shift from investment in manufacturing to investment in financial instruments.
Is that okay? Go on.
Done.
No, it's Phil.
I just said I think Minsky probably captured that quite well. He was writing in the 60s, so I would agree with you that not many people did it, but I'd give Minsky credit.
Sure. I sort of one point to Phil in when we're talking about concepts, and then I'll answer Doug. It's always been my impression that concepts are the building blocks of our present reality. So I don't really see the difficulty here between corresponding between good and bad concepts from a Kantian perspective.
Do you want me to answer that? Or?
Yeah.
Sorry, I think I do understand what who was saying it, Thomas. I think he is correct insofar as that in Kant you are dealing with concepts, and the question of empiricism becomes a little bit more difficult because Kant says that you can never actually approach the noumenon, the underlying reality, directly. You can only approach the sort of false appearances of phenomena. But I think that's just why I think Berkeley, frankly, is a better philosopher. He has a better grasp of the empiricist stuff. I think Kant gets far too much into the weeds on that, and so I guess I'll be very quick on this. The reason I drew on both is because I think that the conceptual schemas in Kant are an interesting and applicable idea, whereas I'd be more so on the empiricist side of Berkeley. But I really don't think we have to. I think as long as we can sort of apply these things and they help us to sort out what's a good and bad abstraction, and just to be able to break a schema away from a model, I think that's I just think it's an interesting step forward in methodological discussion. I might be wrong about that, but I found it very difficult to discuss these things without having a distinction between a schema and a model, and without being able to distinguish them between a schema and some immediately empirically observed phenomenon like a government depositing money in my bank account.
Sure. I'll just make one short point before closing. Didier Sornet, there's been a lot of talk about prediction here in models. Didier Sornet, who's a sort of a Swiss kind of economist, he made a large model, I think it was in 2005, of all econometric predictions. And the conclusion was that if he just guessed, on average, he would do a lot better than most economists. But that aside, one small point in relating to the method we're talking about. What is the distinction that Phil would draw between what we're talking about here and positivism? It's not exactly the same.
Well, I mean, just to be very quick, I don't think that in economics you can falsify a schema, because different schemas will work at different times. Historical time is homogeneous or heterogeneous, as Keynes said in his Tinbergen paper, and so when a given relationship holds in one period, it may not hold in another. Now, in positivism, that would falsify the relationship, but that's because positivism is trying to deal with a homogeneous world. So if I float off the planet tomorrow, Newton's theory of gravitation is gone. We have to completely revise it. I don't think you can hold economics up to the same standard. So I think the idea of schematism, which I'm definitely drawing out of Keynes's economics and his approach to economics, is not the same as positivism in that sense. I think falsifiability sometimes is a correct criteria, but only for people who say that they have absolute laws. Like, for example, I was writing recently about the quantity theory of money. You can falsify that if they say it's an absolute law. But if they say it's a schema that occasionally persists, you can't falsify that. So we're just dealing with a different conceptual system, and it's due to the nature of the material that we study.
Sure. Thomas, you can look at the paragraph of Kant I'm referring to is in what do you call it? It's in the chapter posted on there. So there's a whole paragraph which talks about the object concept and so on and so forth. That's the paragraph I'm drawing on, and it's basically my construction as a philosophy novice. I'm sure you can find fault with it. The whole leap and the criteria, that's all me.
Where when you say on there, where do I look?
It's if you search for abstractions and modeling, Control F, it's right above that.
Search where? On the Facebook page?
It's a document. It's a document posted on there. You'll get a Kant quote on there, anyways.
On the Facebook page?
There's a document there on the event page.
Okay, fixing the economists WordPress.
Yeah. Anyways, I can now tell. We can talk about this. Yeah, on the Basecamp and the event page. It's the text we're using for what do you call for this the whole discussion.
Okay, I'm sorry I didn't see it before now.
Oh, that's all right. It's just that what do you call it's you shouldn't confuse
about AI. Is that the one you're talking about?
No, that's the blog post. That's the blog post. There's a Word document on there that Jay posted. If you scroll down the page. I meant to say that this isn't actually in Phil's book. The whole idea of the leap and the
is it on the Basecamp group or?
Yeah, it's on the Basecamp group. You can get it from there if you like.
Because I can't find it on Facebook. I can look it up on the Basecamp.
Sure.
So I should probably just have been better prepared.
That's all right. As long as you buy the book when it comes out.
Okay, yeah, so I think we're coming to a natural close here. Tui, you want to hear some closing remarks from whoever wants to say something very briefly?
Phil has anything to say?
Yeah, I don't really have anything particular in mind. Just that I think that the very fact that at least young economists are discussing methodological issues is a huge step forward. There's been a massive taboo placed on this since Paul Samuelson's statements in the 1950s, and it's great that people are discussing it.
Right. Well, we appreciate that, and for sure, I think we can say in the name of everybody that you should join our next meetings. Basically, how this works is you pick out a topic that you are passionate about that you would like to discuss with the group and provide some literature. It's as easy as that, and it's just schedule it yourself and get in touch with any of us, Thomas Vass, Kati, Amug, me. We're all running the show, so just feel free. I'm not sure, Amug, if I cut you off. Is there something you wanted to say still at the end?
Oh no! I just wanted to respond to what Thomas said, but I wanted to point him to the document which he now has. I presume, Thomas.
Yeah, I think we can do it offline as well. If once Thomas reads the passage, I think we can have a discussion on either Facebook or Basecamp.
I found it. We can have this discussion later again.
Sure.
Thanks very much everybody for today, and I hope to see you soon. If any of you are not yet on our mailing list, just drop your email right now the chat, and we'll include you. And I guess we can thank Amuk and for taking the time today to make the presentation, and Phil, thanks for writing the chapter. It's been a great pleasure listening to today's discussion.
No problem. Pleasure.
All right, we're signing off. I'll try to post the recording once it's ready. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.